Good evening, everyone. I'm Eve Kahn. I'm head of the Special Functions Committee for the Grolier Club. And this is part of a series that we're doing with the Yiddish Book Center, a whole synergistic, liaising, wonderful, magical sharing of common interests. It's like it's becoming a sort of family connection. We attract the most amazing, illustrious speakers to this unique, gorgeous combination of museum and library and clubhouse. So I have the privilege of introducing tonight, the first of tonight's illustrious speakers, Aaron Lansky, founder and president of the Yiddish Book Center, a nonprofit in Amherst, Massachusetts that recovers, preserves, and celebrates Yiddish and modern Jewish literature and culture. Run, don't walk to go see the new installation of their permanent collection that's absolutely spectacular and enlightening and apparently evolving as we speak, even with new great stuff coming in. Since 1980, Aaron's team has rescued more than 1 million Yiddish books, and today they are bringing old books to new readers through digitization, translation, oral history, and education. Aaron holds degrees from Hampshire College and McGill University, honorary doctorates from Amherst, Hebrew Union College, and SUNY. His awards include a MacArthur Genius Grant and his book, Outwitting History, The Amazing Adventures of a Man Who Rescued 1 Million Yiddish Books, was a bestseller. I'm honored that the Yiddish Book Center chose this gorgeous room for the debut of this fascinating new translation of S.L. Shneiderman's eyewitness testimony from the Spanish Civil War battlefront. We have copies for sale this evening, and the translator Deborah Green will be signing them. We are Jews, so we have a lot of food, and this is going to be great. So fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be an amazing night, and welcome to the podium, Aaron Lansky. Welcome back to our stage. Thank you all for coming.
Well, I love being back here. So shalom aleichem, everyone. Well done. Let's teach everybody else that. So here's the deal. I say shalom aleichem, peace be unto you, and you answer it backwards. So I say shalom aleichem, and you say aleichem shalom. You ready for a walkthrough? Okay. Shalom aleichem. I feel right at home. Okay, that's great. So I'm thrilled to be the introducer of this program. And the reason is I have a personal connection, not so much to this particular book, but to its author, S.L. Shneiderman. And you don't know this, right? So I'll explain. I think it was 43 or 44 years ago, shortly after I had founded the Yiddish Book Center, I got a phone call from my grandmother, who had a very heavy Yiddish accent. And she called me up and she said, I have such wonderful news for you. There's a big article about the Yiddish Book Center in the Yiddish Vorwärts in the Yiddish newspaper. Okay. So I went out and looked for a copy of it, which is no small challenge in Amherst, Massachusetts. But I found it. And I opened it up. And as they say in Yiddish, "Sis mir geworden finster vor de Augen." My eyes turned black before my eyes when I read the story. It was well, we live in an age of polarized journalism, but this was quite opinionated, I might say. And the author, S.L. Shneiderman, took us for task. Who were these young people? Who were these upstarts? What did they know about Yiddish? Why are they saving all of our books? And so on and so forth. So I called my grandmother back and I said, Bubby, it's a terrible article, you know. I said, they just trashed us. And she says, as long as they write, you know. So he wrote, but it really was a little extreme. And despite the passion with which he trashed the book center, there was a certain quality to the writing that just was intriguing to me. So that was back when we still had telephone books, and I phoned him, and I told him who I was, and I said, listen, before you keep trashing us, how about if you just come up and see it for yourself? Well, that was a novel idea. He says, I'll be there next week. So the following week, I went down to the train station in Springfield, which is south of Amherst, and the train pulled up, and I was going to say he was old, but he was probably younger than I am now at the time. But anyways, this man comes out, and he was sort of short and stocky and very powerfully built. And then his wife came out as well, Helena, and they stood there on the platform, and we started to talk. And I said, well, I'm really glad you're here, that you can finally see the book center for yourself. And that's exactly what he did. He came to Amherst. He looked around, he met the staff, and within about 10 minutes, he was in love with us. And what followed were 3 more full-page stories in the Forvits in Yiddish about how great the Yiddish Book Center is. And the central theme of the story was all those yentas who complain without ever having been there ought to read, should go themselves and see with their own eyes. So that was great, but it was also characteristic, I think, of Shneiderman as a writer to go and see with his own eyes. That's very much what he had done throughout the course of his career. I have to just tell you one more other curiosity that was just funny. His wife always called him by his last name. That was kind of de rigueur in that old Yiddish socialist world. She'd say, Shneiderman, come here. So anyways, come on over here. Well, imagine my surprise many years later when I met Ben Shneiderman, who was the son of S.L. Shneiderman and Helena. He was a professor and a computer scientist living in Washington, D.C., and he told me about his father's book, Krig and Shpanyen, The War in Spain, which was an account of the Spanish Civil War. I had never heard of the book. You might find that odd, but when you're living among 1.5 million Yiddish books, it's a little hard to read everything. And so I never knew the book existed. And we have a translation program at the Yiddish Book Center. When we began, 2% of Yiddish literature had been translated into English. We had a program at Yale University Press for 10 years, which was great. We did a book a year, and I thought that was pretty cool until one of our students looked at me one day and he said, you realize at the rate of a book a year, you got 39,000 years to go. So we ended up training a new generation of translators, and Lisa Newman, a member of our staff, took charge of it all, and she had a long career in publishing and knew exactly what she was doing. And so we were thrilled, and I wanted to read the book before we committed to translating it. So I took it with me on a trip, and I couldn't put it down. I thought it was fascinating. It reminded me a lot of The Road to Wigan Pier by Orwell. Which was written at the same time in 1937, and told a similar story in many ways. And there was a commonality between the two writers in that they were both very clear-eyed. I'm going to leave it to some future graduate student to compare the two books. But for now, I was very much struck by that. And I learned that S.L. Shneiderman had been the first Yiddish war correspondent, which was I didn't know there was a first or ever Yiddish war correspondent. But he ended up, most of the Yiddish papers thought it was too dangerous to send their staff to Spain. And so Shneiderman represented all the different Yiddish newspapers. So he had a thing going there, and he sent dispatches to all the different papers in Yiddish. He wrote many other languages as well. And the story doesn't quite end there, though, because Helena's brother, his wife's brother, was Shim, who was David Seymour, one of the great photographers of the Spanish Civil War, along with Robert Capa and Cartier-Bresson. And later on, they founded the Magnum Agency. And Shim had taken a great many photographs. He himself was killed in 1956 while covering the war in Sinai. But Ben very graciously arranged to give us permission to use those photographs, and you'll find them in the book as well when you get your copy of it at the end of tonight. And so before I begin, I have to just do the shout-outs, okay? So just a few thank yous, and then we can really get on to the program. So first I want to say a thank you to Ben Shneiderman, who's now in Vancouver, to his sister Helen Sarid, who I understand is watching us live from Tel Aviv, and to Mark Shneiderman, who's here this evening. Is that correct? Mark, thank you for being here. We're very honored. Thank you. Originally, my plan was to interview the translator of the book, Deborah Green, myself. Except that I thought the privilege really belonged to Lisa Newman for two reasons. One, because Lisa has worked really hard to make all this possible. You don't realize what publishers do until you see them in action. They do a lot. And the other reason is that Lisa has been running a podcast series at the Yiddish Book Center for many years. She's now known as the Yiddish Terry Gross. And she's a very talented interviewer, and I thought she really deserved the privilege of doing this tonight. So with all that said, Oh, wait a minute, hold on. I almost forgot something very important. The book, every book has a sponsor, or at least at our place, where books don't exactly make money. And the sponsor this evening is sponsored with generous support from Randy Leon and John Keith Hirschtig. And I also want to say a special thank you to Tzvi Janka-Lovett. Tzvi, where are you? Our Director of Institutional Advancement. And hold on, let me get some glasses here. And Brianna Burdetsky, a member of our staff, and especially our colleagues at the Grolier Club. So to all of you, thank you so much for making this possible. And with all that said, Deborah and Lisa, please take it away.
Welcome.
Hi.
Hi, it's great to be here. It's been a long road.
Yes, it has.
There are many aspects to publishing, let alone all the work you put into a brilliant translation. So thank you so much for this. I thought it would be interesting to start off by asking you to speak a little bit about your connection, your roots with Yiddish, and also your interest in the Spanish Civil War.
So I didn't speak any English until I was 6 years old. I thought the whole world spoke Yiddish, and I was very surprised when I went to school and they didn't. But I did the best of it. I hope that, someday they would speak Yiddish also. So we know how that turned out. Okay, so over the years, I'm a graduate of the Workman Circle schools, and then I went to the middle school, and then I went to the Jewish Teachers Seminary and People's University right here at 515 Park Avenue. And my whole life was always surrounded by Yiddish. Well, Yiddish was my life, all right? I spoke it at home. I spoke it to myself. I went on to law school, and to amuse myself and annoy my neighbors, I was always playing Barry Sisters, a top volume. But I never really thought of Yiddish as something to do, because it was just part of me. Over the years, I became a lawyer, practiced law for about 40 years, and people would come to me and say, I have these letters from a family member, could you please translate it? Or I have an article, could you please translate? I was always happy to do that, based on the condition that I could not give them a time when it would be done, because it was all dependent upon what I considered my real life. And while I did that, I did a lot of translating of Yizkor books. And in those Yizkor books, I would read, well, Moshe knew how to blow up a train because he had been in Madrid. Or David knew how to fire a rifle because he had been in Barcelona. And it never dawned on me until finally, after I retired, I'm reading this and I said, what were Jews doing in Spain? Why were they in Spain? What is this all about? And then I realized, oh, the Spanish Civil War. And then I discussed the Spanish Civil War with people, and they said, oh, yes, Teddy Roosevelt, Bunker Hill. And I said, no, not Teddy Roosevelt, 1936 to 1939, no Teddy Roosevelt. But I wanted to learn more about this. So I said, that should not be a problem. I went to the library, my local library, and tried to find it in the books written by the major historians of the Spanish Civil War, like Paul Preston, Beaver, Tremlett, and others. In all these books, if there were maybe 10 pages mentioning Jews, that was a lot. And then I come to learn that 1/3 of the international brigades were in fact Jewish. And that between 1936 and 1939, the second most popular language in Spain was Yiddish. Why? Because the medical units for the international brigades had all these Jewish doctors. And these doctors came in from all over the world. And so that was language they had in common. They were speaking Mamelution, my language. And if they didn't speak Yiddish, they spoke German. And there are enough cognates in between German and Yiddish where people could understand one another. In fact, one of the saddest things I read about were there were 2 Finnish soldiers in the international brigades who were terribly wounded. and the nurses wanted to help them, but nobody could speak Finnish. Everybody spoke Yiddish. So yeah, so I found that pretty incredible, but that was later. So I'm at the library. I don't find anything about Jews in the Spanish Civil War. And so then I go to FAU, which is the university near me. I'm from Florida, and there's nothing there either. And by this point, I'm annoyed. And so I called YIVO, and I said, hi, I'm Deborah Green, and I live in Florida, and I want to know, do you have anything on Jews in the Spanish Civil War? And he said, and I quote, I have been waiting for you since 1939. Okay? So about a week later, my husband and I got on a plane, and we flew in, and I spent about a week in the archives at YIVO, and I found incredible amounts of stuff, including original newspapers that were written in Yiddish on the front lines in Spain, where you picked up this paper and it crumbled in your hand. I wasn't able to take it out. They did it for me. They made copies of these newspapers. In fact, if any of you are interested, I have a website called JewsFightingFascism.com, and I'm translating all this stuff and putting it on there. So I have all this stuff, and I have all the names of all these books, but was Tietman, what do we do? What do I do? How do I get these books? I said, aha, the Yiddish Book Center. So I contact the Yiddish Book Center, I get online, and there they are. They're all there, every single book I needed. So I'm sorry to tell you this, Aaron, I didn't buy them. I downloaded them all.
Nobody buys it.
Okay. So I've got tons of these books in white loose leaf binders throughout my office. And the stuff you find is absolutely amazing, particularly now with the OCR. So if I've got a name in one book, then I'm not finding anything else. I simply type in the name, and there it shows up in about a half a dozen other books, which keeps me very busy. So I decided people need to know that there were Jews in the Spanish Civil War. They just need to know this. And so I decided to tell them, because my husband, who's sitting here, Dr. Martin Green, he said to me, if you don't translate and write this, who will? And I said, well, they're translators at the Yiddish Book Center. And he said, that may be so, but they don't know that much about Spain. And I said, probably. So I've been writing about Spain, the Jews in Spain, thanks to the Yiddish Book Center, ever since. And then we went to Spain in order to do more research on the battlegrounds where they had these Yiddish companies, particularly the Naphtali Botwin Company, which was a Jewish company. The orders were issued in Yiddish. They had their own Yiddish language newspaper. And a whole life was going on there that I knew nothing about until 2017. And I had had quite an education in Jewish things, so it was surprising. So I figured if I don't know it, there are probably a lot of other Jews who don't know it, so I'm going to write it. And so I did. And that's how I came to write about Spain.
And we'll fast forward, and you come across this book. And
Yes, so one of the books, could I get some water, please? Could that be happening? Some water, thank you. One of the books that I downloaded was Mr. Shneiderman's book, Krig in Spanien. And I was, I think, a quarter or maybe a third of the way through translating it when I get a phone call from a gentleman, Ben Shneiderman. And Ben says, hi, my father was S.L. Shneiderman, and he wrote this book, and I spoke to Mindel Cohen at the Yiddish Book Center, and she suggested that I contact you because you translate Yiddish, and you're interested in Spain. So we had a conversation about that, and I said, yeah, fine. I'm like a quarter to a third of the way through with it. I'd be happy to finish. So that's how that came about. And It's a fascinating book because I gave it a little bit of a different name. I'm calling it Journey Through the Spanish Civil War because there are probably, I don't know, maybe 100 books called the Spanish War or the Spanish Civil War, which is Krig in shpanyen, that means war in Spain. So I thought of his book more of being a journey because he's going from one town to the next, from one city to the next, meeting all these different people. It was definitely a journey. The one thing he did that kind of broke my heart was he basically split this book into two. First, he talked about the hinterlands, which were the civilian population and the politicians that he met and what was happening throughout the country without dealing so much with the Jewish international brigaders. That was volume number 2, and he did write that book. Unfortunately, it was not published until I think August 30th, 1939. We all know what happened on September 1st. The Nazis invaded. The book is nowhere to be found. I don't know whether or not the Polish censors destroyed it or whether the Nazis destroyed it, but I've been in contact with every person I know throughout the world, by the way, asking, have you seen this book? Do you know of this book? Is there any contact with this book? Nobody knows anything. So unfortunately, I can't translate the second one, although obviously I would love to. I had Zvi from the Yiddish Book Center see if he could find it for me, and he could not. So what can I say? There are other books by when Shneiderman wrote, he did write for almost all the newspapers, the Yiddish language newspapers and the Jewish newspapers, except for the communist press. That was something called Neue Presse. It was all communist, and they had their own guy with initials. His name was T.S. Lansky, and he wrote for them. And it's definitely with a red bent, whereas you don't get that with Mr. Shneiderman's book. It's really hard to know if he's leaning right or left. You only find out about that about 20 years later when he wrote a series of articles for the Fovitz. And then lost from Hals, which means he let it off of his heart. And he wrote what he thought about the communists in Spain. He basically thought that they threw Spain under the bus. And so that was the book. That was Mr. Shneiderman.
So speaking of Mr. Shneiderman and the book, let's speak a little bit about Ben Shneiderman, sorry, Sil Shneiderman and his wife Eileen are in France. Word gets out, and he immediately wants to go to Spain to report.
Oh, yeah.
So, which is the basis for what this book is about. He
Yes.
arrives, he puts himself in all of these places, as you mentioned. You know, he meets everyday people, he goes to towns, he meets politicians. He is a consummate journalist, and we've had this conversation, in that he reports, but he doesn't put his opinion into this book.
Yes and no. Yes and no. The reason he went was after the Pilsudski, who was the Polish dictator up until 1935, and fairly nice to the Jews. The Jews kind of liked him. He was better than the rest. Pilsudski died in 1935, and it was the government immediately went fascist, anti-Semitic. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the laws in Germany and the laws in Poland. They were the ones who wanted to ship 1 million Jews to Madagascar. That was always being discussed in their parliament, unfortunately. That didn't happen, although the Jews were pretty much upset about them wanting it to happen back in the day, but be that as it may. There were a series of pogroms, and one particular one in a shtetl or a city that I'm not too good at pronouncing. It's pronounced like Prishk. There's a lot of vowels, a lot of vowels. And there was a pogrom. A number of Jews were killed. Their produce was destroyed. It all took place in a market. And then these pogromchiks went from house to house, breaking in, breaking glasses. People were killed. Children were beaten up. It was a disaster. But there were a few Jews who had guns. They had bought some guns in the city of Radom a few 2 months prior, because these pogroms were popping up all over Poland. Anyway, one Pole was killed. One of these pogromchiks were killed. And so the prosecutor in Poland decided he was going to prosecute 14 Jews for defending themselves against the Poles, the Polish pogromchiks. There were charges brought against some of the pogromchiks. They had like 6 months to a year for killing children. But the Jews, they got some serious sentences. And Shneiderman was very, very upset about this. He had already left the country. He had left Poland because he had written a few things that the government did not care for. And so the government was anxious to arrest him or do something to him, but he was here for this. And when he heard about the war in Spain, he said he had to go to Spain because there were so many Jews going to Spain from Poland. They were not going because all of a sudden they developed a warm and sweet feeling towards the Spanish, because they still remembered 1492, but they were going because they were anti-fascist. They were afraid of Hitler. They were afraid what would happen if Spain went fascist. And he wanted to be there. He wanted to develop a sympathy for the Jews in Spain from the other Jews in Europe, and so that they would send money to support them there. And that's exactly what happened, particularly in France. Was a great deal of support for these people from France. And so he went. And he met a lot of politicians there. And with almost every politician he met, he asked how they felt about Jews moving to Spain. And almost every one of them, in fact, I can't think of one who didn't, all of them said, we love Jews, we want Jews, we've got some Jews here, we're embarrassed about the edict from back in 1492 from the Catholic monarchy. We want them to have a home here. After the war, all these international brigaders are going to get automatic citizenship in Spain. We love them. But he was prescient in feeling that Jews needed a place to escape to. Unfortunately, Franco won, and that was the end of that.
So again, he is bringing us, the reader, into the situation. We're meeting all these people. In the course of the book, you begin to really understand the complexity of the history in Spain, both for the Jews and for Spaniards and Spanish Jews. And this, I hope you can answer this, but what do you think Shneiderman wanted the reader to take away from this?
From the articles he was writing?
Yeah.
Well, as I said, he wanted the Jewish population throughout the world to support the international brigaders who were there. He was concerned that Jews needed a home. I think that was really primarily his purpose. He was very, very upset about the anti-Semitism that was rising throughout the world at the time, certainly through Europe. Even here in the United States, we had the German-American Bund, who, they had Kuhn, who was their president, hopping around in a Führer's outfit, giving lectures at Madison Square Garden. You had the Silver Shirts in North Carolina. Their head wanted all Jews and all blacks to be thrown out of the country. There was a lot of this going on. There was Father Coughlin out of Detroit, Michigan, and that was millions of listeners. A lot of that was happening, and it wasn't the UN then, it was the League of Nations. They just kept talking for 3 years. They would not help what was going on in Spain because it was a legitimately elected government. The Republicans were the real government, but they did skew to the left. And so none of these other countries wanted to help them. In fact, the rationale was let the left and the right, meaning the fascist governments at the time, Italy, Germany, kill each other, and then we don't have to worry about them. But things didn't quite work out like that, because although the democratic countries were not helping Spain, Germany and Italy were sending men, materiel, airplanes, all kinds of help, all kinds of money to Franco. And although Mexico did help, Mexico did send money and supplies to Spain, to the Republicans in Spain. Russia also helped, but Russia demanded the entire Spanish treasury as a guarantee for the supplies that they were sending. So at that time, Spain had the largest treasury in all of Europe. It was about $600 million in gold, and it all went to Russia. Then Russia, I'm sorry if this sounds too much like a history lesson.
We might want to pull back from that, because
Okay.
I think one of the things that's so brilliant about this book, for me, the reader personally, is that for somebody who doesn't come to it with the knowledge that you did, I really understand the complexity of this situation. It has resonance in the world.
Today also.
Yeah, it's prescient. And I think, again, Shneiderman does a masterful job of really putting all these pieces together. You see it from a number of different sides. He seeks out people who can help you to understand that history.
Absolutely.
You also understand the culture. So I don't want to get too far off, because you have a incredible knowledge of this, which is phenomenal. And I think it's why your translation reads the way it does.
Thank you.
Because you really understand what this is all about and the story he's telling. So I'm going to ask you, if I may, at this point, would you read a little section of something, an excerpt that
Sure.
is particularly resonant with you, that you really like as the translator?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I really had to make up my mind about two separate things, but I decided to go with whom I call Ferdinand the Bull, just because when I was writing about this particular bullfight, I kept visualizing that cartoon character, Ferdinand the Bull, with the, standing there and smelling the flowers and the bouquet. Also, another thing is, once I would read a lot of this stuff to my husband after I translated it, and once I translated the stuff about the bull to my husband Martin, he kept telling me the same joke over and over and over again about bulls. So that stayed in my mind. It's a little off color, and I'm sure he'd be happy to tell you the joke after this is over. I'm not going to let him do it now, but only when the first bull entered the ring and rampaged around the arena did the crowd erupt into cheers. But suddenly, the bull ended his mad chase and strolled into the center of the ring, where he stopped. He looked confused, surprised by the cheers that literally caused the walls of the building to tremble. 4 men with red capes approached the bull. The bull entangled himself in the banderia's red cape each time a banderia came close to being gored, making the mob cheer once more. Soon the crowd's enthusiastic shouts changed to protests and curses, because the bull had developed other ideas. A handsome fellow, the dark brown bull allowed his tormentors to chase him around the ring a few times, but then decided to stand calmly in the middle of the stadium and look at the crowd with what appeared to be a grin on his face. The bull had fast become accustomed to all the red banners draped around the building, and the banderia's capes no longer inflamed him. He seemed to bow to the audience. The picador galloped up to the happy bull and stabbed him in the back. The bull retaliated by butting his head into the horse's belly, forcing the rider to fall to the ground. Ignoring the fallen picador, the bull turned his attention to the crowd once more, uninterested in fighting the banderillas. Although he was bleeding, the bull stood quietly, but the crowd was furious. They whistled and stomped and threw the little cushions provided to the audience members for their comfort, as if they were hurling grenades at the picador and the banderillas. The picador's cowardly and unsportsmanlike behavior had ruined the event for the audience. Now, this is Shneiderman speaking. He says, "As soon as I sat down, I recognized the man sitting on my right as a compatriot. He confirmed my suspicions when the picador continued stabbing the bull. The man squeezed his fists in anger and screamed in Yiddish, 'They're ruining my bull's hide.' I stretched out my hand to this young man immediately, greeting him with a heartfelt, 'Shalom Aleichem.' I soon learned he was a fur merchant from Warsaw. He purchased these bull hides and used them to make soles for shoes. He seemed to suffer as much as the bull each time the picador's sword pierced the bull's side. He blamed the bullfighter's incompetence on the revolution, adding it to his growing list of grievances. The true artists of the bullfight support Franco,' he told me. 'There are only bunglers left here. You should have seen the fights last year. The hides were beautiful, not tattered like now.' The matador entered the arena to rescue the situation and settle accounts with the unfortunate bull. Hiding his sword within a red cloth, he fluttered the cloth before the bull's eyes. The bull moved toward the cloth and the crowd regained its enthusiasm. They showered the matador with gifts of pencils, fountain pens, notebooks, and more red, black, and red handkerchiefs. The prior insult to the bull forgotten by everyone, except perhaps the bull. Thank you.
So, a question I ask translators a lot. What were some of the challenges? Because you have to, well, you do have to kind of get into the head of
So
the
this is the
writer.
thing. This is the thing. And I mentioned this to Ben Shneiderman when I spoke to him. Shneiderman had a particularly acerbic sense of humor that was very, very similar to my father's sense of humor when he wrote. There was a certain element of sarcasm in almost everything he said. And I loved that because I felt connected to the man, like I knew this man. And I asked Ben and a sister, was I right? You know, was this the personality? And the answer was, yeah, pretty much so. So I was able to start from that supposition that I'm dealing with my dad. Now, the thing with Yiddish and English is interesting. There are, I think, about 750,000 words in the English language that are used. There are only, I want to say, maybe 200,000 in Yiddish, maybe less, maybe 150,000, certainly nothing modern. So when you're sitting there with a Yiddish sentence or Yiddish paragraph, you have to figure out what is the best word in English to use. And you have such a vast choice. So you need to get the subtext going on as, yes, he's saying this, but does he really mean that? Which is very common in Yiddish. You know, one person will say one thing, but he means something entirely different. So once I got the sense of that, it was easier for me, but I would go back. I must have rewritten this, I don't know, 10 times, maybe 15, over and over and over again, because I was trying to get the absolute sense of what Shneiderman was saying. And to me, it comes across very vividly when he was talking about this gentleman, Jaime Mittervalls. I'm probably mispronouncing his name too. he was a communist, and he was also in charge of setting up the foreign correspondents, all the foreign journalists, where they could go, who they could meet. He would provide for their transportation, whether they were going to go in a tiny little car that was a junker, or like Shneiderman did in a Hispano Suiza, which is pretty impressive. If you've never seen this car, I would suggest you look it up. It's gorgeous. How much are they?
Now?
Yeah.
Find one?
Yeah.
$5 million.
Okay, about $5 million. Gorgeous cars. So when Shneiderman described this guy, and everything, by the way, had to go through the censors. So he talks about how hardworking this man is, how he's there like 24/7, and he provides for everything. And without this guy, he could do nothing. But he made it very, very clear that this guy, this Miraval's, Jaime, was the one who would decide whether he could actually go to certain cities and interview certain people. And so he was kind of sucking up to this guy, but with the sarcasm built in, particularly in Yiddish, because his readers were all Yiddish and they were going to get it. They were going to get what he was saying. When the censors read it, I don't think they caught what he was saying, because I don't think they would have let that through had they really caught the sarcasm there. So that's the way he wrote. That's what he did. He went on and on about this Warsaw guy, the merchant from Warsaw. I didn't want to read the whole thing. But then he gets into a conversation with a legionnaire, one of the older Spanish gentlemen. And he's saying he doesn't believe that they're allowing these bullfights because the bullfights are so horrible. And then the legionnaire turns to him and says, well, what they do in your country, is it better watching somebody beat the hell out of somebody else or gouge their eyes out? And so he really didn't know how to respond to that, because, yeah, that's what happens in boxing, wrestling, etc. So, but he would take that into account, and he would acknowledge that perhaps he didn't quite get the culture. And by doing that, it made him investigate the culture even more deeply.
One of the things in thinking about it is, I mean, he paints these portraits of these people brilliantly. Again, I keep using that word, but I mean, you really get to some core aspects of who this person was. And yet you realize he must have had this encounter over the course of one day, because he's going from here to there to there.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, were there any, singular characters that he meets up with and reports on, or one chapter that, besides the bull, that really sort of began to pull it all together for you in terms of his writing?
Yeah, he writes about, he and his some other correspondents went to, they were driving back to Valencia from wherever they had been, and their driver got lost, and their driver would not admit that he got lost. So they're off the main highway. They're now on this little country road, and they don't know where they are, what they're doing, or what's going to happen. And so they start beeping the horn and whistling and yelling, and finally these two peasants come out carrying rifles, and they come over to them and say, what's the problem? And he said, well, we're trying to get back to Valencia. And they said, you're really going the wrong way, because you're heading towards Zaragoza, where all the fascists are right now, and they're fighting. So they careen out of there. They go traveling. They start telling each other stories about other foreign correspondents who've gotten stuck with the fascists. And they're creating horror stories as they speak to scare the hell out of each other, until they get this one town called Carlo, which was a town that the manufacturer there was perfumery. And there's a massive crowd in front of the town hall. It's about 10 o'clock, no, about 11 o'clock at night at that point. They don't know what's going on. Their car is stuck. They can't get through. So they get out of the car. They're trying to push through. Nothing's happening. And somebody says the magic word, foreign correspondent. And all of a sudden, the crowds, they open up and they let them through. Turns out they had brought in 180 children from Madrid who had either lost their parents or their parents were still fighting. And they brought them to this town, and the people in the town just adopted 180 children in the period of 1 hour. and this really impacted him. He said he had read all the books that there were about World War I, which basically was his war, and he had never read of anything that showed greater compassion and who these Spanish people were. That impacted him a great deal.
The other story that I was impacted by, because he did put a little of himself out there, was they're having dinner and there's a child who has suffered greatly. So many members of the family have been either brutally murdered, lost, and he's having dinner with this child who's obviously really traumatized. And so he pulls out his reporter's notebook and he pulls out a pencil and he starts to draw for the child. And it gives this child this moment of needed childhood. And I think he really sort of laid himself bare. Yeah, you get to see who he is.
Yeah.
So I'm going to end with this so we can open up for questions. And my last question for you would be, what do you hope readers will take away from the book?
You really want me to go there? You
I asked the question.
Okay. I'm so glad you did. I started writing this book shortly after Russia invaded. No, so I started writing it shortly before Russia invaded Ukraine. And you know that old aphorism, if you don't learn from history, it repeats itself. What I was seeing at that time, and a little bit now too, was the hesitation to help Ukraine. Let me put this out there. I'm not a fan of Ukraine. Okay, my parents' families were killed in the Ukraine by the Ukrainians, so I'm not a fan. But to let Russia go in and do what Russia was doing was kind of similar to letting Franco go into Spain and let Franco do what he was doing. And the United Nations weren't helping Ukraine. They were having all these discussions about it, but they weren't really pushing it. In fact, just recently, it's been almost a year that we have not sent aid to Ukraine. We just started sending it while the politics here were playing out. And meanwhile, thousands of people are dying. And all kinds of territory that had been taken back by the Ukrainians were once again lost to the Russians, and the Russians were getting a better chance of taking more property. That really, really bothered me a great deal. And then, of course, it's the growing anti-Semitism that's going on right now. Doing the research about the pogroms in Poland and in Hungary and in Germany, of course, and all these other places. And people just, oh, well, okay, you know, they're the bad guys. The Jews are the bad guys in this trial. Being a lawyer, retired lawyer, I was appalled that this prosecutor in Poland would go after the Jews who were defending themselves, just as much as I'm appalled now about people going after the Israelis for defending themselves. And so reading this and being aware of the historical facts in the 30s and what I see happening right now, I find devastating, just devastating. And I say to my husband often, I just wish somebody would just send history books to all of our politicians, to every member in the UN, to everybody who can make any kind of decision throughout the world. They need to learn from history. Most of them don't. It's like, if it didn't happen while I was alive, or if it didn't happen to me, it doesn't count, doesn't matter.
Thank you.
You're okay with that?
Yep.
Okay.
It's your answer, Deborah. And again, thank you for this. And we'll open it up to questions. One caution is, because we have video and because people can't always hear, if you could wait when we say you're on until the microphone comes to you. So.
Thank you thank all of you for this wonderful talk, and thank you for the nasharai. I was a graphic designer, and if I was working on something that was going to be translated into another language, some languages run longer, so we had to leave space to accommodate it. Does Yiddish run longer or shorter?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I would say probably shorter because there are so many Yiddish aphorisms that just sum it up like that.
Yeah.
You know, you don't have to
Yeah.
get into detail.
And what does SL stand for?
Okay, Shmiel Leib.
And I hope we hear the joke later.
Well, now you're putting me on the spot.
I'm sure he'll be happy to tell you the joke.
And from a graphic design point of view, I'll tell you the hardest thing I've learned in putting these books together is the use of ellipses, and certain kinds of ellipses is the biggest challenge.
I'm curious if you did research at Alba.
You mean where they had all the fascists?
No, Alba, the Lincoln Brigade
Oh, yes.
library down
Yeah,
at the Tanneman
yes.
Library.
I'm sorry, I wasn't thinking along those terms. Yeah, a lot. In fact, when I was in Spain, I went through basically Catalonia. I didn't get to go to the nice parts. I went to Catalonia. It was not so wonderful. But I had a guide by the name of Alan Warren, who is an Englishman who got fed up with England and just moved there. And he probably knows everything you had ever wanted to know about the international brigades to the point where it's frightening. He actually dresses like it's the 1930s. He takes part in Spanish Civil War recreations. He's learned how to speak Spanish. And the slightest little detail, he runs about 4 different websites about the Spanish Civil War. And he took me places that are really amazing. He schlepped me through this mountain in a forest. It was all forested. And I'm going, why are we here? And he says, I have something to show you. And we get to this spot near a tree, and there are 3 graves, beautifully maintained, and photographs of 3 men on the tree who were the men who were buried there. And I said, this is amazing. I mean, look at it, it's beautiful. Who's taking care of this place? He says, the villagers. I said, there are Jews in the village? No, but they appreciate what was done. I said, that's great, but why is this so hidden? Why not have a direct path? I'm sure people would want to see this, particularly American tourists. And he said, the reason they don't is because the next village over was fascist. And although it was like 80 years after the event, the village was afraid that the people from the next village would come and desecrate those graves. And in fact, on my website, I have pictures of this, of the tree and the graves that are there. So I spoke with the people at Alba, and they were very interested in this project. But they are basically Americans. And my interest was really among non-Americans.
Because I grew up with a lot of the people that fought there, and they were all Jewish.
Exactly.
And they had, every year, they would have the reunion of all the people who had served in the Lincoln Brigade down at Cooper Union. And they would line up all the veterans. There were 20, 30, 50 and every year there would be 1 less or 2 less, but they would stand there. And the thing that was so beautiful about these people, they were extraordinarily ordinary.
Yes.
And they would go and tell their story. Hi, I'm Jaime from Bensonhurst,
Right.
you know, and they would tell why they went.
Mainly East New York, Brooklyn.
Yeah.
East New York, Brownsville. A lot
But
of
it was very, what I'm curious about was how, because I grew up knowing all this, and you're saying you didn't know about it until later on in life.
I didn't.
Yeah.
I didn't. After I started learning, my father really knew how to hold a grudge. So he was still angry with Spain. Don't laugh, I'm serious about it. He was still angry. And so it was not really anything that we discussed. Giving you some background, my father was in a gulag. He hated communists. My mother was a communist, a real communist. In Europe, she did time in Europe for being a communist. So dinner conversations, very interesting. It's probably why I became a lawyer. I learned how to argue both sides at the same time. But they never did, you know, and unfortunately, they were gone by the time I could speak to them. But I found, right now I'm working on something else in addition to the Jews in Spain. I'm working on something called Heroines of the Holocaust, which are about Jewish women who fought in the resistance, particularly in the forests. But there's this one guy that is amazing. His name was Carton, and his last name was Carton. No, and he was also known as Andre Schmidt and a few, half dozen other names. But he fought in the Spanish Civil War, and he was in the Gurs camp in France after the war, where these international brigaders were sent, got out of there, went to the Soviet Union. They parachuted him into Poland with the intent of having him train the Polish partisans. And he wound up in the Warsaw Ghetto, planning to act as a liaison between the Polish partisans and the Jews in the ghettos, except the Polish partisans were a little too anti-Semitic, and they said, no, we're not going to do that. And he said, okay, the hell with you. And he started training the guys in the Warsaw Ghetto, who ultimately did the revolt, the April Revolt, the January Revolt, then the April Revolt. And he unfortunately was captured by the Gestapo because a Polish partisan turned him in. And he never made it to the revolt. But there are a number of men that you can see that progression where they go from Poland to Spain to Russia and then back to Poland. And you know, I've read a lot of these books and I've heard authors, and I hear about all these Jews, they were all communists. That is complete and utter nonsense, because in the Jewish population, only 5% of Jews were communists. And the reason the number was so low is because communists don't believe in God. So all of these would-be communists had parents who did believe in God. And being a communist, having your kid be a communist, was a shande. It was not something to be proud of. So a lot of these kids, although they were left, were not communists. But you had the whole Judeo-Bolshevik nonsense going on. I'm using that word in lieu of another word because, anyway. So people just think, oh yeah, all the Jews, they went to Spain, they were all communists. Not true. They were anti-fascists. They were the original Antifa, which does not mean then what it means now, but they were there. And if you read about them, they write about this. While it's going on, they're writing about this. They're saying, yeah, we really feel sorry for the Spanish people, but the real reason we're here is because we're anti-fascists and we want Hitler to lose.
Question back.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a really beautiful jacket. And forgive me if you've already mentioned this, but I wonder if that photograph was taken by his brother-in-law, David Seymour, Jim?
Yes.
Yeah, and in the back of the book, which you can see back there, we also included many of the photographs of Shem that were in the original Yiddish book.
Harriet, did you have a question?
Yeah.
Do Shneiderman's manuscripts survive? What kinds of manuscripts made it out of Poland to the States?
These were all published in various newspapers. What is in this book? I'm trying to remember the name of the paper that he was writing for, but they were easy to get because the articles went throughout the world. If there was a Yiddish press, it went there. And so finding the stuff is not difficult. He picked whatever he wanted and created this book. It was published in, I want to say, 1938. And obviously there are copies extant, and there are other articles that he wrote that were not in this book, particularly the ones that he wrote in the 1970s for the Fovitz, when he speaks about how he felt about what was really going on in Spain.
Hi, thank you for this talk. I had a question about Sephardic participation in the Spanish Civil War. I researched Jewish participation in the Spanish Civil War in 2018. I wish I had had this resources at the time. And during my archival research, I couldn't find anything about, yes, Sephardic participation, which would have been obviously interesting based on where this was occurring.
Is there a question?
Sephardic participation, was there any? Because we're talking about Yiddish speakers.
Well, what happened, it was interesting there. There were a lot of Judeo-philes in Spain. And they felt that the Sephardic Jews were almost a completely different species than the Ashkenazic Jews. And so from my reading, they were telling the Germans, Franco was telling the Germans, keep your hands off the Sephardic Jews because they're ours, not so much with the Ashkenazi Jews. So you had many, many more of the Ashkenazi Jews who were involved. And there was also a certain hierarchy within the international brigades. So if you were a communist or a member of the Komsomol, which was the youth organization, or the Comintern, you had a higher rank because the communists were taking over what was going on over there. And a lot of people were afraid to say who they were. Most of them had pseudonyms, which is why doing research is really, really difficult because you're not really sure who's who. So you can't tell by the name in many instances. Are they Sephardic? Are they not Sephardic? There was no records kept of who was Jewish, who was not Jewish. So you can't tell like that. It's easier to tell with an Ashkenazic name than it is with a Sephardic name, because obviously you had a lot of Spanish people in the Spanish Civil War, and the Sephardic had a lot of Spanish surnames. So it was much more difficult to tell who was who. I'm assuming there had to have been enough Sephardim within their fighting. But I would say mainly they came from France, Poland, the United States, and percentage-wise from Palestine, surprisingly. And then they went back to Palestine, which kind of puts to rest the question of were these Jews communists or not, because they had an option of going to Russia, and they didn't. They went back to Palestine. So that's pretty much all I can tell you. I wasn't really focusing on the Sephardim. If they came up, I took notes, but I wasn't looking for them particularly. I was looking to find out who were these people who decided to go to Spain.
I think we have time for one more short question. Yeah?
Deborah, you mentioned that your emphasis, your focus had really been on the Jews, not necessarily from the United States. Mm-hmm. But I'm not that familiar with the brigades. Where did they all come from? And if you can, just quantify percentage-wise quickly for me.
They came from 50 different countries.
And the participation from the United States?
There were, I want to say, about 2,700, 2,800 brigaders from the United States, 1/3 of whom were Jewish. The percentage of Jews, well, there were about 40,000 international brigaders, and about 25% to 1/3 were Jews.
Really?
Yeah. And the medical units were almost entirely Jewish, which should come as a surprise.
Before we leave, I just would like to recognize Mark Shneiderman, who is here. The other Schneidermans are on the West Coast, and as Aaron said, in Tel Aviv. And I believe that you wanted to say a few words on their behalf. Yeah. Do you wait for the microphone? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for giving me a minute, and Deborah, appreciate it. So this is really, I'm speaking on behalf of my family, in particular for Ben Shneiderman and Helen Sarid, who wish they could be here but could not. And they asked me to let you know how much they appreciate the creative work of Deborah Green in translating the journey through the Spanish Civil War, and the hard work of Lisa Newman and her team at the White Coat Press and the Yiddish Book Center. My father was Marius Shneiderman, who had a warm relationship with his uncle Samuel. Marius, who is an artist, has exhibited his work at the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, where my sister Toby's family is warmly connected to Aaron Lansky's family, and she lives in Amherst as well. As Ben liked to say, we may live in a global village, but may prefer to think of it as a global shtetl, where close connections over many years nurture us and enrich our lives. Ben wanted everybody to know that the English translation joins recently published Polish and Spanish translations of this book on the Spanish Civil War, reminding us how Samuel and Eileen Shneiderman's partnership in 1936 and 1937 produced a powerful report on the Spanish people's struggle against fascism. Kirkus Reviews described the book as a valuable, intimate narrative of war, a powerful record of courage, brutality, and suffering. Having an English translation means that many more people can appreciate its enduring lessons, which are still relevant for us today. And I'll just mention, for me personally, this event brings back vivid memories of Samuel and Eileen, who we knew as Emil and Hala growing up. And Samuel was the gregarious kind of, but very serious personality that I think Aaron described really well, who always greeted me with a strong pinch on the cheek, really left a mark on the cheek. And Eileen was a warm and lively personality who really could light up a room, and really the counterbalance to Samuel. Samuel was always with a stack of Yiddish or English papers that he was ripping through. Even when we were in a big back gatherings of the family, he would yell at the television, very passionate about current events happening in the world. And later writing articles and stories in English and Yiddish, obviously, and writing down his ideas, that Eileen, as typist and editor, was really an invaluable partner in all his work. And he was very emotional and passionate. She didn't get the credit in writing, but she really was his partner in everything that he did. And I think I was very fortunate to have been a witness to them growing up, and I really appreciate this work. It's bringing back great memories for me, and I very much look forward to reading it myself. So thank you.
Great. Thank you.
And I want to thank you for a wonderful translation, and it's great to bring it to all of you readers here. I want to give a huge shout out and thanks to you, Eve Kahn, and to the Grolier for hosting us once again. I don't think we could find a better home. Thank you. So thank you for coming. Books are available, nibbles, noshes, what have you, in the back room. Thanks.